Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I'd like to talk a little bit about culture and classical Catholic education. I just finished a chat with a homeschool mother who's looking at the Catholic homeschooling landscape, as it were, and just feels overwhelmed with all of the options that appear to be available, all the decisions that need to be made, and being an honest Catholic parent, she just feels overwhelmed. She doesn't really understand how to make those decisions or where to begin. And in our chat, I explained to her that the complexity and the variety of homeschooling and Catholic educational options are really just an appearance. They're really just a mirage. That they don't really exist. And the reason why is because while many people are throwing together packages and products to try and sell in this homeschool market, what parents need to do to avoid that mess, the glut of supplies and services that are available, is simply start by focusing on the goals that they have for the education of their children. If parents would take more time to set goals for their children's education, they would see that there aren't many options. There are really just a few options. And if you want to give your children an education that is like the education that was enjoyed by the saints, there's only one option, as you'll see if you work through the details. But even before this question of goals comes up, there's a big elephant in the room that everyone tries to ignore, and that elephant is the issue of Catholic culture. For true classical Catholic education, to give your children an education like the saints, there's a culture that's assumed to exist. And for most Catholic families, that culture doesn't exist. And if that culture doesn't exist, then this discussion about education and talk about raising saints is really, to be honest, is a bunch of nonsense. When we look back at the lives of the saints, we have to consider the practical details and circumstances of their lives. Think about the patron saint of Catholic education, St. Thomas Aquinas. We look at this young man who is praised by St. Albert the Great, one of his teachers. We look at all the works that he did. We look at his amazing intelligence and the wisdom of his writings, but we don't study his life and look at the conditions under which he was raised, in which he lived. Thomas Aquinas grew up in 12th century Italy, went to school in Paris later on. He lived in a thoroughly Catholic culture, which, to be honest, our children are not living in. Our children are not living in a Catholic monarchy. We're living in a secular democracy, and that presents a million challenges for us and for our children that we have to take into consideration. But even more than that, if you dig into the life of Thomas Aquinas, you'll learn that when he was 5 years old, so think of your 5-year-old child. When Thomas Aquinas was 5 years old, he was sent to live in a Benedictine monastery. And he was raised by monks in a monastery. He lived with the culture and the rigor and the routine of a Benedictine monastery, and that in the 12th century. So when Thomas Aquinas was raised, he wasn't just sent to a school. There was no special book that he used. It wasn't a certain curriculum. It was an entire life that he was immersed in as a young child and raised in a certain culture in which and out of which his education grew. And we have to take that into consideration. Another important saint in parenting and education is Saint Aloisius Gonzaga. He's the patron saint of youth. He's famous for his devotion and piety as a young boy. Well, it's all well and good to talk about Saint Aloisius Gonzaga and how he's the patron saint of youth, but when we look at his actual life, we find that he was personally catechized as a child by St. Charles Borromeo, or it might have been Robert Bellarmine. Both of them, I believe, were involved in his life. He was under extraordinary influence from men who are famous for their wisdom and holiness in history. And many of the saints we talk about grew up with certain conditions and certain culture that allowed them to be incredibly well educated at a young age. St. Dominic went to university for studies when he was 14 years old, already prepared and fluent in classical languages. And so when we talk about the education of our children in secular, democratic, capitalistic America, we have to consider how the culture is different. We have to consider the effects that the difference in culture has on our children. We have to realize that as parents, we face really extraordinary obstacles. Historically speaking, the obstacles that we faced are unprecedented. And unless we go back into the very earliest days of the church when the apostles were spreading the faith in the Roman Empire. We have great obstacles to deal with. We have a million distractions that there's no way to completely keep them out of our children's lives, from distracting them, from luring them away from Catholic studies, from Catholic devotions and disciplines. And it's just a circumstantial reality that we have to live with. And we have to consider this as we strategize as parents and seek not to quote unquote raise saints, because that's not in our power, but to simply do our duty and to fulfill our obligations to our children and to God to give them the best possible Catholic education. The Catechism has a lot to say about that. The Catechism talks about the duties of parents, and I recommend you take some time to read those paragraphs in the Catechism on the duties of parents. I'll put a link to those paragraphs in the description of this video. But I recommend you look at the duties and understand the duties that are the same regardless of culture, regardless of time and circumstances, because those have to be our primary concern. There's a lot of ignorance. There's a lot of copy and paste parroting in Catholic homeschool circles where a conference speaker popularizes a phrase or takes a phrase out of context and it spreads through the homeschool community, and it's not true. For example, it's said that parents are the primary educators of their children, and that's true. Those words are found in the Catechism. Parents are the primary educators of their children. But if you go and look at the context of those words, primary doesn't mean best. It doesn't say parents are the best educators of their children. Primary doesn't mean only. It doesn't mean parents are the only educators of their children. Primary, in the context, if you go and look it up in the Catechism, primary simply means first. Parents are the first educators of their children. Think of it as when we talk about primary school. primary school simply means elementary school. It means the first years, the first level of schooling. That's what primary means in the context. Parents are the primary or first educators of their children. And that's just an example of how some phrase is injected into the homeschool community and begins to be copied and pasted and parroted out of context that leads to all kinds of confusion. And this is very common in Catholic circles, where so many people are simply depending on conference speakers and cheap book writers for their information. The reality is that there is a Catholic culture that needs to be in place in Catholic family life. And Catholic education, especially classical Catholic education, can only be rightly understood within that context. Now, when we consider what that culture is, the Catechism teaches us about the culture in which children should be raised. And this doesn't depend on the state you live in or the country or the government you live under. It doesn't depend on what the condition of the local parish is where you live. The culture that the Catechism talks about is family culture. It's household culture. And parents have to make sure that they're doing their job to put this culture into place. Because this classical Catholic education, the education enjoyed by the saints, will only make sense in this culture. The two systems, the culture of the Catholic life and this classical Catholic education, go together to form a whole. And if we try to use one without the other, it doesn't work. The culture without the education doesn't work, and the education without the culture doesn't work. And you can learn this the hard way, or you can simply learn from what the Catechism tells us about the duties of parents. First of all, Catholic parents have to live the Catholic life. They have to be models of Catholic devotion and obedience to the Church. Most of what the children will learn, they will learn from picking up the habits of their parents. That doesn't mean they're going to continue in those habits, but much of what they learn about the Catholic faith, they're going to learn from the behavior of their parents. So, sacramental participation, your activity, your participation in the sacramental life is a primary means by which your children learn the Catholic faith. Going to Mass on Sundays, going to Mass throughout the week, making regular confessions, praying at home. The habit and the culture of the life that exists in your home is like the air that your children are going to breathe. They're going to imitate what they see. Even if they wander from it, even if they veer from it, their default behavior is going to be imitation. And you provide that model for them to imitate. And if they choose to walk away from your example, you have a clear conscience because you've provided the example, you've set the model and provided the culture, and they may make a choice to abandon it. But that's got nothing to do with you. And so when parents contact me and ask me about classical Catholic education, especially when they have young children, they're looking at courses and lessons and studies and they're interested in academic things, and I stop them and I say, if you're responsible for a child who's 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, you shouldn't be talking about academic subjects. Because there's a much more influential issue that if you don't have right, your children will never progress in real Catholic studies. If you don't have cultural issues in place, the child's not going to grow intellectually. These studies are not for wild houses. These studies are not for undisciplined children. These studies are not for the unschool community and all of this nonsense that's popular among homeschool families today. Classical Catholic education is not a joke. If you're going to pursue these studies, you have to have some things in order, or at least be working to have them in order, or it's impossible. It's impossible if you're not really committed to Catholic culture. So what I tell parents early on is, the first thing you need to do as a homeschooling parent is establish a Catholic environment where these studies make sense. If your house is a circus, if the TVs are on and there's a million things going on and just worldly chaos in every room, you can't bring these studies into that house. The scriptures teach us that wisdom will not enter into a soul enslaved to sin. This isn't a game. This isn't a joke. This is the real pursuit of true wisdom. And if the house is a circus, that's not the place for wisdom. If you want your children to progress in classical Catholic studies, the first thing you have to do is you have to establish an environment where these children are going to live and study that supports these studies. The house has to be orderly. The house has to be quiet. The house has to be devout. The family life has to be focused on spiritual things. And in that context, these studies will flourish. There has to be a family schedule. And I've written an article, How to Create a Schedule. There has to be a Catholic family schedule that makes sense in light of Catholic culture. If you look at the schedule of a monastery, you'll see that the daily activities of the monks or of the nuns is ordered around prayer. It's not ordered around meal times. It's not ordered around what time ballet class is or what time TV shows are on. The monastic life is ordered around hours of prayer, and the family life should be ordered in the same way. If you're a Catholic family interested in classical studies, you should have a house that, to the greatest degree possible, is like a monastery. Monastery is not something strange that exists for itself. The monastery is arranged the way it is because it's designed to be the ideal place for the cultivation of Catholic virtue. That's what it is. It's not just some arbitrary set of rules and schedules and activities. The purpose of the monastic life and the culture of the monastery is to allow Christianity to grow and flourish among the members of that community. And in our homes, to the greatest degree in our control, we should seek to bring a similar culture into our daily routine. And so I can ask, is your family schedule ordered around Catholic prayer? Is your family culture comparable at least to the life of a monastery? And you may think that sounds ridiculous, but I can tell you the Catholic families who succeed in classical studies, this is true of their families. Their homes are like little monasteries. So you can scoff at that or roll your eyes at that, but the Catholic families that are raising boys who become priests and go on to Catholic studies, they usually come from homes that were run like monasteries. Their parents usually attend daily Mass. They usually are given a devout Catholic education. They usually are taught to admire and imitate the saints, and by imitate we mean live like them. do the things that they did. And if you read the lives of the saints, you'll see they didn't live like normal American people. They lived extraordinary Catholic lives. They did radical things to set themselves apart from the world. And these things aren't optional. These things are part of the culture that's necessary to promote holiness and to pursue wisdom. So there's a culture that's assumed when we talk about classical Catholic studies. We're assuming that kids are going to Mass. We're assuming that teenage children are studying and being confirmed. We're assuming that young boys are serving at the altar at Mass. We're assuming that these students are praying with their parents and praying at church, whether that's praying the Liturgy of the Hours, praying the Rosary, other Catholic devotional prayers, studying sacred scripture, learning Catholic music. There's a culture that should exist in the home into which these classical Catholic studies should be set. When those two things come together, beautiful things can happen. But if we try to separate these things, neither of them proves to be very fruitful. And when we look back at the lives of the saints, and when I say lives of the saints, I'm talking about saints who were actually devout as young men and women. And we can find many examples of wild, sinful teenagers who later became saints. That's a different issue. But when we talk about saints who were raised to be Catholics and became young saints, their lives are quite common, with many similarities. But they enjoyed rich Catholic culture. They were immersed in Catholic culture. Their parents went to great extremes to surround them with holy influences, monks, nuns, other saints, and so on. They didn't just throw some books at them and think that, oh, if you buy this curriculum, you can raise saints. If you think like that, and if you're acting like that in homeschooling, you don't know very much about the saints, because that's not how they were raised. And I encourage you to read the biographies of the saints. Don't just watch movies which are an hour long. I mean, read the biographies. Authorized biographies. Biographies written by their own friends, by people who knew them, by their own religious communities, and so on. Get into the details of their lives, the practical details. Saints were very practical people. They didn't just talk about religion in vague terms. They got into the nitty-gritty details of what it really means to be holy, minute by minute, day by day. And those details are very helpful and important for us. So when we talk about classical Catholic studies, the first question is, are you working to provide your children with an environment in which Catholic devotional life and classical Catholic studies can actually develop? It's like a greenhouse. Are you providing as far as you're able? And I realize that we all have obstacles around us. We have unconverted relatives, unconverted neighbors. There's all these distractions and obstacles. I understand that. I'm a first-generation Christian. My father is involved in my children's life. He's not a Christian, and I have to overcome those influences. Our neighbors are not Catholics. We live in a Protestant area of the country down in North Carolina. There aren't many Catholics around us. I understand how all of those different things influence family life. We have to find ways to overcome them. We may not be able to overcome them, but we're responsible to God to do our best and to make every effort that we can to overcome them. And we've got to make sure that we're providing a culture that is conducive to classical Catholic studies. We can't just tack classical studies onto a wild, unprincipled life. So that's the first thing I always tell parents. Concentrate on this. This is in your control. Establish an environment that's conducive to classical Catholic studies. Secondly, pray. Don't be a hypocrite and force your children to pray. Don't focus so much on the kids. Focus on yourself as the model. Be the example. Say your daily prayers. Fulfill your spiritual duties. Maintain your devotional life. Be a model. Set the example. Show the children an example to imitate. They're watching. They will see your example, and what will give all of your enemies the easiest success in drawing them away from Catholicism is if you try to lead them in a hypocritical way, telling them to do things that you yourself don't do. You can be religious. If you want your children to be religious, you can be religious. You can join a third order, a lay community in a religious order. You should consider that. That's the best way to show your children how much you think of religious life, by making the greatest effort you can to seek out that life yourself. If you want your children to be devout Catholics, are you a devout Catholic? Do you attend daily Mass, or as often as possible do you go to Mass? If you have free time, do you use it for religion or for something else? That's your real lesson to your children. That's your real voice. Your children see your example. They hear your words, and no one believes words anymore, especially today. They're looking at your example, and they see what you really believe, what you really love, what you really like. And you have to make sure that they see what you want them to see. So establish the culture, set the example, and then thirdly, understand that education is a major work that takes years and years and years. If I get a contact from a parent asking questions about what they should do with their children, and they tell me the child is 7 years old, I think you have 11, 12, 13 years. So take 12 and multiply it by 365 days and multiply that by 24 hours a day. You have so much time to work with. There's so much time. There are going to be so many obstacles, so many hindrances, so many difficulties, but there is so much time, and you have to commit to this work with perseverance. You have to be willing to fight this fight for 10, 11, 12 years. That's what educators do. We have to fight this fight for a long time. This isn't a decision you make when your children are 8 and then you go around talking about that decision for the rest of your life. This is a decision we have to make every hour of every day for years and years and years. It's a long-term plan. It's a long game that has to be played. And you have to enter into it with a realistic set of objectives and understand the time frame over which these things are pursued. It doesn't matter that you put in a zealous week of homeschool work. It doesn't matter. This is about 10, 11, 12 years. It doesn't matter if you put in a good day or if you put in even a good year of studies. It doesn't matter. This is a long game. And if you don't set things up for long-term success, you're going to crash and burn. It's not going to work. And you're going to be like most homeschool families that are just constantly bouncing around from this program to that program, to this book, to that book, to this teacher, to that author, bounce, bounce, bounce all over the place with no realistic plan for the work of Catholic education. You can't just throw money at stuff. You can't blame books. You can't blame this or that. It's hard work that takes a long time to accomplish real results. And while that may seem overwhelming at first, it's actually a source of comfort and encouragement, because we say things like Rome wasn't built in a day. We don't say that to discourage anyone. We say that to say you have to be patient. This is extraordinary, heroic work. This is the most important thing in life. It's not going to be easy. The results are not going to come quickly. It's going to take years and years of work and study. The more you bounce around and flip-flop and change programs, you're just running in circles. That's not doing anything. And it goes back to what I said in the beginning. What are your goals? You have to establish your goals. You have to make clear goals. And you're going to see that you'll be challenged to do this because and I say this just to be honest and helpful, we're not as smart as we think we are. These things are not as easy as we pretend they are. You'll see that when you sit down to write goals, you're not as smart as you think you are. It's difficult to figure out what are the goals of Catholic education. It's not an easy question. It's not an easy question. And then once you're able to establish the right goals, then you have to move to objectives and ask, for each of these long-term goals, what are the short-term, step-by-step objectives? The steps by which we move from where we are to the achievement of this goal. Setting those objectives is not easy. And then once we've established all of those objectives, we set task lists of what tasks are necessary to move from one objective to the next over time. And then when we have those tasks, we can then form a schedule and know what we need to do day by day, hour by hour. So when we start talking about schedules and curriculum, but that talk is all premature. And this is why the homeschool community is what it is. So many publishers are just perfectly content to start throwing products at people who haven't even set goals yet. And the parents just fall for that marketing trap of modern homeschooling. You have to set your goals. Those goals have to be clear and achievable. You then have to set objectives. And from objectives, you need to lay out tasks. And those tasks and objectives are going to tell you what book you should use, whether you should study online or offline, whether you need a tutor, how much it's going to cost, how much time it's going to take. All of those questions of curriculum and methods and so on, they can only be determined after you've already established your goals, objectives, and tasks for those objectives. And I will assume that you haven't done that work yet. And that's why homeschooling seems overwhelming. And parents just look and start listening to marketers and salespeople trying to sell them products. And it's not how it works. If your goal is to educate your Catholic children as saints were educated, there aren't many options. In fact, I would argue that the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is the only option. And so when you look at it, you look at what's required to succeed in those studies, and you see this is a long-term plan. This is a long-term project. You've got to be willing to commit to that long-term project. You've got to understand how to pursue long-term goals. You can't be like a child with a 5-second attention span that just bounces from thing to thing and is always looking for something new. You've got to understand how to pursue a long-term goal with realistic objectives. You have to have the patience and the self-control to work little by little, day by day, through times where you don't necessarily see results because those results develop incrementally. I tell parents that education develops exponentially, meaning that it sort of goes on an upward slope. You have to be willing to go through those difficult years in order to bear the fruit in the end. It's like if you keep a garden, a summer vegetable garden, you'll know that you plant the seeds and it's very, very slow. There's almost no sign of growth, no sign of development. Then finally, the plants emerge from the soil, and again, they just slowly develop, and you're continuing to water them and keep the garden weeded, and slowly they grow. But as the summer goes on, the growth gets faster and faster and faster, and it feels like you go out in the morning and the weeds have exploded, entire fruits have grown overnight. The growth increases exponentially over time. And that's how education works. We have to be willing to do the slow and patient and sometimes boring work day by day, year by year, in order to put our children in a position where they can have that fruit in the end. And most Catholic families are not doing that. They're looking for fruit in first grade, like a gardener staring at a day-old plant coming up and wondering where the fruit is and starting to get anxious and panic and say, I need to use a different fertilizer. I need to check. It's just not realistic. The growth and development are slow. We're talking a decade of work, 18, 20 years of work by parents to produce these fruits. And we have to make sure we're seeking the true fruits. We understand the time frame we're working with, and we have a realistic and mature approach to the work of education. Otherwise, we're just bouncing around like silly people, being tossed back and forth by the latest catalog or conference speaker that comes along and throws out the new product, and all of a sudden everyone's got it's embarrassing because the system is what it is and there's no other way. And we have to do what was done with and for and by the saints, and that process is understood. That process is known. The 7 liberal arts, the classical Catholic curriculum, there's no mystery here. We have to learn how it works. We have to learn what it takes. And when we get our goals and objectives aligned with the classical Catholic curriculum, then Catholic homeschooling and Catholic education in general can become fruitful in time. But until then, we're just spinning in circles, running on treadmills. And that's what you see if you look at Catholic education. There's a ton of activity, but there's very little fruit, very little fruit. And there's a reason why there's very little fruit. And like I said, you can listen to that and get offended and say, or you can look at that and say, that's encouraging because there's not a lot of fruit, but it's because we're doing things wrong. It's like having something wrong with your body, having a pain or a sickness and going to a doctor, and the doctor says it's no big deal because this sickness is caused by this. And all we have to do is remove the cause, and these symptoms will go away. That's true in Catholic education. But we have to remove the cause. We have to get to the cause. And the cause is there is a system of education that produces the fruits we seek. But it's not some silly catalog solution. It's not some silly box curriculum. It's not some local school you can throw tuition money at and send a kid there for 6 hours a day for 180 days a year. That's not realistic. The classical Catholic curriculum is not the problem. We know what that is. It's sitting there waiting for us. We're the problem. We do not have the culture and maturity and patience that's necessary for our children, for our students to enjoy these fruits. And we have to change that. We have to commit to establishing real Catholic culture. Not talking about men's beards or what kind of beer you're drinking. All this nonsense is counterfeit Catholic culture. We have to talk about the sacraments and our participation in them. We have to talk about praying at home, praying the rosary, praying the liturgy of the hours, and so on. We have to talk about studying the scriptures as a source of devotional material, and you'll do that if you go to Mass, and if you pray the liturgy of the hours, you'll be reading the scriptures, but you can read them even more in your Catholic Bible with your children, and make these the things that you talk about in your family. Studying the lives of the saints, not in lazy one-hour movies, but in the actual detailed biographies of the saints, and getting into the practical details of their lives. By setting good examples for our children, by establishing homes where it looks like Catholicism is present. A look at the family schedule reveals that we pray without ceasing, like St. Paul tells us to. We're living like saints. That's what needs to be restored for a classical Catholic education. So my advice to young parents is always stop talking about academics, stop talking about all of this advanced stuff, because all that talk is premature. You need to establish the goals for your education, for your children. You need to ask what objectives are necessary for those goals. You need to look at the tasks that will need to be achieved to reach those objectives. And you need to ask whether you've created the environment, whether you have the resources that are necessary for those tasks. Many Catholic families don't. Many Catholic families are averse to working for money, and then they come to educate their children and pretend that they're going to do it for free. It's not going to work. One of the most important things parents can do is earn an honest living that can make resources available for their children's education as a part of their duties as parents. Many Catholic families simply don't have the money that they need to accomplish the goals they talk about. They have wine taste and a beer pocketbook, as we say. So parents need to be parents. They need to make sure they're doing their work and providing for the needs of their children in a real world that has all kinds of limitations. Things cost money. Things take time. These are the real challenges of Catholic education. And parents need to get realistic about these things. Look at the family budget. Look at the expenses at the end of the month and ask, does that look like a home that's trying to raise saints? Or does it look like anyone else's monthly budget? We have to take those things seriously. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, everything's available, but there are very few, very, very few who can commit to this work long term. Very, very few. You can start well, you can start playing around, dabbling with the early classes, Aesop's fables, some Latin reading, maybe some arithmetic, petty school videos. That's all cute. But it's not until you get into Latin grammar and classical reasoning and rhetoric and moral philosophy and sacred scripture and catechism that you're really getting into it. And those studies take time. And we have to be realistic about these goals we talk about, because it doesn't look like we are in Catholic culture. And just to bring this to a conclusion, This talk of classical Catholic education assumes the presence of a Catholic culture. And parents have to create that Catholic culture. And if they do, and then bring these classical studies into that Catholic culture, beautiful things are going to happen. So I want to encourage parents. I'm not saying this to be critical, because that would be a waste of time to be critical. That wouldn't help anything. I'm saying this to give parents encouragement, because they have to focus on their duties. We have to focus on our duties as parents. We can accomplish these things. There's lots of time. As much as I talk about money and the costs of these things, they're not expensive. They're not expensive. It takes time. It takes stability of life. It takes consistency. And the only way you can have that consistency is by living the routine Catholic life, hour by hour, day by day, year by year. The Catholic culture is what makes these long-term achievements possible. That's why the two go together. So if you're getting started or looking to get started, don't start talking about Latin and Greek, and you need to start talking about the sacraments, prayer, your family schedule, your daily routine, how you dress, how you eat, when you sleep, how you work. You need to create the culture into which classical studies can come, or they're not going to come, and the fruits are not going to be born. So I say this to encourage parents, because you can do it, but you have to pursue it in the right way, with the right expectations, with the right discipline, with patience, playing a long game, looking to long-term goals, and being willing to sacrifice all of these short-term pleasures for the sake of these long-term goals. If you're willing to do that, anyone can succeed in these studies, as history proves. But we've got to be realistic. So let's work to establish that Catholic culture, and then we can set these classical studies into that Catholic culture. And when we do that, then we can really talk about imitating saints and educating our children like the saints, because their education came in the context of Catholic culture. I hope that's helpful. God bless.